This morning's scripture reading will be from Acts chapter 14, verses 8 through 10. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul looked intently at him, and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking.
Good morning. It's a good day to be here. It's a good day to be with you, and I'm thankful for your presence here. Of course, in the New Testament, it's broken up in about 4 different parts. You've got the gospel accounts, the accounts of Jesus' life in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those run pretty well parallel together. And then you've got John we throw in there, and he's kind of his own, there's something about the name, right? Kind of beats to his own drum, huh? And then and then you've got Acts, which follows the gospel accounts. And after the book of Acts, you get into the epistles. And those are simply letters written to Christians and churches, encouraging them to abstain from false teachers, encouraging them in the things that they need to do in order to be faithful to God. And then John writes another book, Revelation, which again, apocalyptic in nature, but foretelling and encouraging the church about the things that are going to come, with the encouragement, of course, to remain faithful. The sequel to the gospel accounts in the life of Jesus is the book of Acts. Luke wrote both accounts, and part 1 is Luke and part 2 is Acts. So if we could say it like this, as we read the book of Acts, what we get is, this is what happens after Jesus died. This is the now what. Jesus and his life of sacrifice and his life of dedication and faithfulness to God. This is what we do in response to that life. And as such, we arrive at the theme that we've had for this year is simply getting back to what it means to be a follower of Jesus, right? Simply a Christian. The non-denominational, no frills, no nothing, just good Bible Christian. So that's the idea that we have, of course, been approaching in our goal in life, really, but in particular this year. In that regard, we find ourselves at the turning point in Luke's account in Acts chapter 14. We are halfway through with the book of Acts. We arrive in Paul's first journey, as we call it, his first missionary journey. We arrive at the place called Lystra. And in Lystra, after his stint at Iconium, Lystra is devastating for a lot of different reasons. But in the back of your minds, I want you to remember in Acts chapter 13, the Jews hated the message of salvation so much that they drove Paul out of their city. And as we find out, as we move through Acts chapter 14, they're not done. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. So we arrive at Lystra, and Lystra is going to be an important part. There's a fella coming up in Acts chapter 16 that we're introduced to named Timothy. Timothy is from this city, and you can only imagine all the things that he is seeing and putting the puzzle pieces together in his own life as he is listening to this here in Acts chapter 14. But it all begins with what Clay read for us in 8, 9, and 10, that there's a crippled man, and he was healed. So the rest of that account, and you can imagine if somebody is healed after a crippling disease or whatever it is, that there would be great joy and rejoicing. But listen to the reaction, what happens after that. So this is beginning at verse 11. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done in healing this man, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." All right. This is a first, right? I mean, is what these must be gods. Barnabas, they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker, or depending on which translation that you're reading, it could say Jupiter, one Greek gods, one Roman god. It could say Jupiter and Mercury. Same thing. One is this great, powerful God, and that is, of course, Barnabas, and Paul is the chief speaker because he was, of course, the one who talked the most. So this is what happens in verse 13. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. All right. So you can imagine the stir, right? The buzz that's going around the city. Hey, everybody, come on, come on, come on. The gods, we're looking at the gods. They've come down here, and here's Zeus, Barnabas, and here's Mercury or Hermes, Paul. Why do you say that? Well, here's this man, and now he's healed. So the message, all right, after healing this man, I want to focus on what happens next. That's the stir, that's the buzz, and this is what's happening in the city. So the rest of the text begins with what Paul says in response to, "Hey, you must be gods." Let's read that. 14, 15, 16, 17. 14 and 14. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying, "Men," in verse 15, "why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains and from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." That's what he says in response to this. So let's focus on that very briefly, and let's kind of summarize it. And Paul begins with, they rush out into the crowds, and they, verse 14, they tear their clothes, right? Stop. That's the first thing. So you can imagine them rushing out. They just got called gods. And most of us, we would pat ourselves on the back and be like, yeah, I am in pretty good shape. But they tear their clothes, they rend their garments, and they rush out into the crowd and say, "Stop, right? Stop this. What are you doing?" And tearing your clothes, that's nothing new. And it's not necessarily unique to Paul and Barnabas. You remember Caiaphas in Matthew chapter 26. After Jesus made the admission with the question, "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus says, "You say that I am." Caiaphas, in his anger, the high priest, the one who led him to the cross, he tears his clothes. You remember that out of anger, he tears his clothes. You remember in the book of Job. Job opens up, and Job chapter 1, of course, is this account of a catastrophic loss of a man's livelihood, his family. And one servant comes in after another saying they've taken everything. And then the very last servant comes in and having his 10 children The last servant comes in and says, your children are gone. They've died. Job chapter 1, verse 20, Job's response in grief is what? He tears his clothes. There's another interesting account. Well, there's several more, but in Esther, okay, the book of Esther, uh, very very cool. But in Esther, the plan is made by Haman to destroy all the Jews, right? To kill, to annihilate, and destroy all the Jews. Mordecai, who is sitting daily at the gate of the king, hears about this, and his response, chapter 4 and verse 1, is what? He tears his clothes. Now, I guess my question is Mordecai, is he angry or is he in grief? And I think the answer is, well, yeah. I think he's angry at the command. Why is this even an option? But I think he's grieved because here are his people that are about to be lost. So you see almost on opposite ends of the spectrum, anger and grief, people tearing their clothes and just anguish, okay? So you arrive here in Acts chapter 14 and verse 14, they rush out into the crowd and they tear their garments. And what are they, angry or are they grieved? Yeah. Yes. I think that's probably, yeah, both, right? Like angry, like I'm just a man. This is not what we're trying to do or say. We're just trying to help people know God. Anger, but grieved because they know so little about God. So they rush out into the crowd, and the first action that they take is essentially like, stop all this. But continue with me, okay? He says in verse 15, let's back up 14. But when they heard this, the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it. They tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out their first words, men, why are you doing these things? We also, of course, are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news. By the way, we could translate that as we bring you euangelion, transliterated, evangelize, evangelism. We bring you the gospel. We bring you good news. This is it. Here's the good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God. Look at what you're doing. You're coming out of the garlands and the sacrifice, and we're just men. Stop, turn away from these vain things. And we know what vain is, right? Just absolute pointless. There's no point to it. The book of Ecclesiastes has a lot to say about vanity, doesn't it? Turn from these vain things. This is how vain these idols are. And I came across this. Well, it's been in there for a while, but in preparation for this lesson, I was like, man, that is perfect. Isaiah chapter 44 in verse 13. Look at what he says here. Isaiah records this. He says, the carpenter, as they make these idols, the carpenter stretches a line, he marks it out with a pencil, he shapes it with planes and marks it with a compass. He shapes it into a figure of a man with the beauty of a man to dwell in a house. He cuts down cedars, he chooses a cypress tree or an oak and lets it grow strong among the trees of the forest. He plants a cedar and the rain nourishes it. Then it becomes fuel for a man. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. Also, he makes a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and falls down before it. Half of it, in verse 16, he burns in the fire. Over half, he eats meat. He roasts it and is satisfied. Also, he warms himself and says, I am warm. I've seen the fire. And the rest of it in verse 17, he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." When you see it, I mean, laid out like that, you see how completely vain and pointless this idolatry is. They have hands, as he writes later on. They have hands, but they can't do anything. They've got eyes, but they can't see anything. They've got ears, but they will not hear you. Why? They are vain. And worship, worshiping them is complete vanity. So he rushes out into the crowd and tearing their clothes. We've got good news. Turn from these vain things, these things that won't do anything for you, to a living God. There's a God that is alive. That's the good news. You don't have to worship Zeus or Hermes, Mercury, Jupiter. You don't have to worship any of those because there's a God that's alive and he's asking you to come. The enticement after this, after he encourages them to come away from their vain things, to turn away from them, he encourages them to listen to what's around them. Listen to the witnesses that God is already giving you, right? I mean, just look around you and see everything that God has given you that points to him as the creator. Read it with me. That you should turn from the vain things to a living God who, in verse 15, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not, verse 17, leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven, fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. God sends his rain on the just and the unjust, right? I mean, you look up in the skies, you see the clouds, and I mean, lately they could produce rain, they could not, depends. But you got to ask, where did all of it come from? You see the rain falling to the ground. Where did it come from? You see the sun high up in the sky beating down heat on you, and it's 115 degrees, and you ask, where did it come from? There's only one explanation. Everything that has been created, it has to have a creator. Where did you come from? God has always left himself with a witness. Well, the psalmist puts it this way very quickly. Let me read this to you in Psalm 19, which my heart has always been drawn to. But read this, verse 1. The heavens, look at this. Psalm 19, 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. According to verse 1, 2, and 3, everybody knows God. Everybody knows that there is a creator. The heavens declare anybody who lives on God's green earth knows that there is a creator because his creation testifies to it. Okay. Paul puts it this way as he writes to the church at Rome, chapter 1, verse 20. Ironically, he's about to get into the vanity of idolatry. But look at what he says here. For his, talking about God, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, Romans chapter 1, verse 20, his invisible attributes, his divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. How? How has God's divine nature, his omnipotence, how has it been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world? In the things that have been made. Turn from these vain things to a living God. Look around you. All these things, they are pointing you to the creator of the world. He goes on in chapter 1 and verse 20 of Romans, and he says, so they are without excuse. If you live on earth, there is no excuse not to know God. If you can see the stars, there's no excuse not to know God. If you've been warmed by the sun, there's no excuse not to know God. If you've sat under a tree, there is no excuse not to know God. It's been clearly perceived ever since the foundation of the world. So they are without excuse. So his message is pretty simple. Stop with all this. Turn away from the vain life and the vain, idolatrous ways that you are pursuing, and listen to God. But the response necessarily isn't favorable, because as you continue this story in Lystra, you arrive, I want to read beginning in verse 19, you arrive at the persecution that Paul endures. Even with these words, verse 18, so we don't skip something, even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. Verse 19. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, in verse 19, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose and entered the city. And on the next day, he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel to that city, they had made many disciples. They returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. I love it. And I don't know if you paid careful attention, but if you did, Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and participated and pushed the stoning of Paul. After Paul regained his strength, verse 21, where did they go? They returned to Lystra, where he was stoned, to Iconium, and to Antioch. If that doesn't give you chills up your spine and strength and a fire in your bones, I don't know what will. But look at a couple of things, okay? Paul is laying, and they assume that he's dead. What he does is he gains strength from other people, because they surround him. In verse 20, they suppose that he's dead. And in verse 20, when the disciples gathered about him, he rose and entered the city on the next day. I don't think it's a coincidence that as the Spirit writes this, he says, when the disciples gathered around him. There's something about being surrounded by Christians that gives you a sort of strength that is indescribable. And I'm not saying it's a supernatural thing that happens here, but I do believe that it is not a coincidence. We need each other, and the strength that we get from each other is so vital to our Christian lives. But what does he do? You know, it's one thing because when you get kicked and you get beat up and spat out, the world just absolutely mistreats you. What do? I mean, that's the next step. As Americans, right? We pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and we focus on ourselves. I mean, you're not going to persuade me to not. What Paul does verse 21 and verse 22 is what? He has an outward focus, doesn't he? With the strength that he gets from those who surround him, he uses that strength to strengthen other people. Do you see that? When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. I wonder if he goes to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch and he says, hey, look at these. Look at these bruises. You remember that? Or I don't know what it would have looked like, but I can imagine being stoned and left for dead, that probably you've got a broken bone or two. Maybe there's a disfigured finger in there. And he's like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. The gospel cannot be quenched. We strengthen other people. When we ourselves receive strength from our brothers and sisters, we use that to strengthen other people. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. With the comfort that we get from God, the God of all comfort, we subsequently comfort other people. It's not a selfish pursuit, but it's an outward pursuit. Then in verse 23, what they do is they strengthen and fortify the church. From there, as you gain strength from yourself and you strengthen other people, of course, what happens as a subsequent is that you strengthen God's church. Here in particular, they appoint elders in every church with prayer and fasting, and they commit them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Strength, 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 strength. But it all comes back to God, doesn't it? All comes back to God. Let me read you two more passages and then the lesson's going to be yours. I believe what Paul demonstrates here is a wonderful representation of this proverb in chapter 27 of the book of Proverbs. It reads like this, verse 17. Maybe you've heard this before. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. Iron sharpens iron. One man sharpens another. He received strength from his brothers and sisters. He in turn strengthened other people. The church further established, solidified. Lastly, look at this. Book of Ecclesiastes, we referenced earlier. This wisdom literature here, what it says here in verse 9 of chapter 4, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. We need each other. In here, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, you look at this very last verse in verse 12, because in verse 9, it's two, and it's through the whole thing. It's two are better than one, two, 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 two. And then you get to the end in verse 12, and it says, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Always kind of struck me, and that's kind of strange. I don't think my English teacher would appreciate that very much, but isn't it ironic that when you and I are united together, there's a lot of things that can come between us, aren't there? I don't know if you've ever lost a friend over something silly. And you look back 15, 20, 30 years later and you're like, that was dumb. But there is a bond when you and I are united with God that cannot be broken. That's the threefold cord: me, you, and God. When we unite together under the banner of God, nearly unbreakable. But the question is, both of us have to have the relationship with God in order to make that work. So the question, do you have that relationship with God? Have you turned from the vain things in this life? Have you started serving God in the way that will honor Him? Or are you still living in the vain life of the past and something that will bring you nothing but destruction? Do you need to come to Him? Do you need to begin that walk in baptism? Start living for Him? Well, you can do that right now. Or maybe you need to come back and come back to the fold. Won't you do that as we stand and sing?